Jungkook stood trembling outside Taehyung's door, heart racing with secrets. But the door never opened, and silence became the loudest answer. The rain hit his back like punishment. Jungkook didn't move. His knuckles were red from knocking, breath fogging the air in shallow bursts, but he stayed frozen in front of the door, Taehyung's door. It had been 37 minutes since he arrived, and the silence on the other side hadn't changed once. He hadn't meant to come. He had told himself he wouldn't. But the letter in his coat pocket, the one that smelled faintly of pine wood and pain, burned like truth against his ribs. "Please," his voice cracked into the night, barely audible even to himself. "Just open the door." There was no answer. The hallway was dimly lit. The buzzing light above flickered and died. Somewhere on the third floor a faucet was dripping. Somewhere in his chest something was breaking. Earlier that evening, his hands had been shaking for an entirely different reason. He'd spent 2 hours writing what he couldn't say. Every word on that crumpled page had been ripped from memory. Nights when Taehyung had laughed at nothing, when they danced in empty studios until sunrise, when silence had been comfortable instead of cruel. He had memorized Taehyung's apartment number without meaning to. 6B, the brass numbers on the dark green door were worn and slightly crooked, like the history between them. He knocked again, 3 short raps, not desperate, just hopping. A shuffle inside. He leaned closer, head bowed. "It's me." Still nothing. The guilt gnawed at him. "You waited too long. You didn't say it when it mattered. You left when he needed you most." The memory stabbed him. Taehyung standing backstage, hands clenched, eyes glassy. "You never even fought for me." Jungkook had walked away that night. Pride, confusion, maybe fear. He didn't remember what had felt more important than reaching out, but he remembered the silence that followed. It had stretched into days, then weeks, and now months. Until tonight. Until this unbearable ache forced him here, where the ghosts of their past lived louder than anything he could say. Behind the door, he imagined Taehyung on the other side, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes dark and unreadable. Maybe he was pretending not to be home. Maybe he was listening to Jungkook's heartbeat through the wood. He pulled the letter out slowly, hands trembling as he flattened the paper against the door. "I wrote this for you," he whispered. "If you don't want to see me, I'll leave it here." It wasn't just ink. It was blood, regret, apologies without ego. He slid the letter under the door carefully, afraid that even that sound might shatter whatever fragile thread remained. Still silence. Jungkook leaned his forehead against the door. The world around him blurred, the icy wind, the rain soaking his jeans, the city that never slept. None of it mattered. "I miss you," he breathed. A quiet thud like movement. He straightened, eyes wide. Hope, reckless and sharp, burst through his chest. But no knob turned. No light slipped through the crack under the door. Nothing. He stood for another 17 minutes, long enough to feel foolish, long enough to feel like he deserved it. And then slowly he stepped back. The hallway swallowed his warmth. The door remained shut. As he turned and walked away, his shadow trembled on the wall. Inside the apartment, Taehyung stood still. He had heard every word. He hadn't moved from his place beside the door, hadn't even dared to breathe too loud. The letter lay like a wound at his feet, soaking in droplets of rain that had snuck in beneath the frame. He didn't pick it up. His fingers hovered. The last time he'd seen Jungkook, he had sworn to never let him back in, not just into the apartment, but into the parts of him that still remembered how his laugh felt against his collarbone, how his voice had once said "forever" without flinching. Taehyung closed his eyes. Outside, the storm had passed, but the ache remained. And the letter stayed unopened on the floor. The rain had stopped, but Jungkook felt wetter than ever. Water clung to his skin like regret. The walk from Taehyung's building back down to the street had been slow, reluctant, like every step was a betrayal of his own heart. The city hadn't changed. Neon signs still blinked with indifference. Taxis splashed through puddles. Lovers still held hands beneath umbrellas. And he was just a boy with a soaked coat, an empty chest, and a door that hadn't opened. He didn't go home. Home felt like another lie. Instead, he found himself sitting on a bench by the river. The hand always seemed to know how to listen. Lights from the bridges shimmered on its dark surface, trembling like truths too fragile to speak aloud. His hands were still trembling, as if the weight of that silence pressed down on his bones. He had stood at Taehyung's door, hoping for a miracle, and what he'd gotten was the sound of his own breathing. But was that really all? No, he had heard something. A breath. A movement. Something just behind the door. Taehyung had been there. Jungkook was sure. That made it worse. The silence hadn't been absence, it had been choice. And somehow, that choice shattered him more than if no one had been home at all. He pulled his knees to his chest, letting his forehead rest against them, and exhaled shakily. The cold had sunk into him now, not just the weather, but the chill of rejection, of knowing someone had heard your plea and still decided not to answer. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. He didn't check it, not right away. There had been too many notifications these past months, fans, managers, deadlines. None of them Taehyung, not once. He finally glanced at it, more out of instinct than hope. Just a message from the group chat. Jimin asking if everyone was free for dinner next week. Jungkook read it 3 times, his chest tightening. He couldn't bring himself to reply, not with this ache still sitting inside him, heavy and unmoving. His thumb hovered over Taehyung's name in his contacts. The last message was from 6 weeks ago. Jungkook, I saw your painting on IG. It's beautiful. Hope you're doing okay. No reply. No read receipt. Just blue-tinted silence. He deleted it. Not because he didn't mean it, but because it hurt to see it go unanswered. Behind him, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against his damp hair. He remembered when Taehyung used to do that, run fingers through his hair absent-mindedly, always when Jungkook was overthinking. You get too quiet when you're scared, Taehyung used to say, his thumb brushing along Jungkook's cheekbone. Talk to me. Jungkook had never realized until too late how often he'd stayed silent when it mattered most. He didn't know when things started falling apart. There hadn't been a single explosive argument, no betrayal, no screaming accusations, just distance, missed calls, short replies, the slow death of closeness disguised as being busy. It wasn't anyone's fault, and yet, Jungkook carried the guilt like it was entirely his. Because he had noticed the change in Taehyung's tone, the hesitation in his laughs, the way his hugs had become polite instead of tight, and he had done nothing. Had said nothing. Until it was too late. The letter he left tonight hadn't just been an apology, it had been a confession. Of every word left unsaid. Of every moment he wished he'd held on tighter. He didn't expect it to fix everything. He didn't expect forgiveness. But he had hoped, naively, that Taehyung would at least open the door. That maybe he would look at him, even with cold eyes, and say, "You're too late." At least then he would have known. At least then he wouldn't be stuck in this limbo of maybe. He stood finally, feeling the stiffness in his knees. The river glittered behind him, quiet and uncaring. His breath misted in the air. It was nearing midnight. He walked without direction, past the coffee shop where Taehyung used to doodle lyrics on napkins, past the convenience store where they'd once had a heated argument over instant ramen flavors at 2 a.m., past the train station where they'd once missed the last train and ended up talking for hours on the platform about fears and dreams and what the world might look like when they were 30. He hadn't been back to Taehyung's place in months. But tonight, his feet turned toward it again. He told himself it was just to check. Maybe the letter was still on the floor. Maybe Taehyung hadn't even looked at it. But when he reached the building again, Something in his chest jolted. The hallway smelled the same, like old wood and faint laundry detergent. He moved slowly, unsure, each step dragging like regret. And then he saw it. The letter wasn't on the floor anymore. It was gone. His heart lurched. Had Taehyung read it, thrown it away? Laughed at it, burned it? Jungkook stared at the base of the door like it might give him an answer. And then, the door creaked. Not open, just a slight shift. A sound that would mean nothing to anyone else. But to Jungkook, it felt like thunder. He waited, breath caught. Nothing more. Still, it was different than before. He stepped closer, lips parting. "Did you?" his voice caught. The door remained closed. But it had moved. And that God, that was something. He didn't knock again, he didn't speak. He just placed his hand flat against the door, palm warm against the cool wood. "If you ever want to talk," he whispered, barely louder than a breath, "I'll be here." And he turned away again, this time with a heart not healed, but maybe, just maybe, not entirely broken either. Inside, Taehyung sat on the floor, the letter open in his lap. His fingers had traced the lines so many times, they were smudged now. His eyes were red. Not from anger, but because every word felt like the truth he had waited months to hear. Still, he couldn't open the door. Not yet. Not tonight. But soon. Maybe soon. And that, he told himself, was its own kind of beginning. The days that followed passed in blurred fragments, each one suspended in a state of almost. The letter remained in Taehyung's drawer now, tucked beneath layers of sketch pads and notebooks filled with half-drawn ideas and abandoned dreams. He couldn't bring himself to read it again, not yet. But he also couldn't throw it away. That act would feel too final, too irreversible. As if the moment he let go of that single folded paper, he would be letting go of something bigger, something sacred. He spent hours by the window, staring at nothing, the city crawling beneath him in its usual chaos. People moving, lives colliding, laughter echoing from the sidewalks. The world didn't stop for heartbreak. It never had, not even for theirs. There was a kind of cruel poetry in the fact that the only person he wanted to talk to about the letter was the one who had written it. But what would he even say? That he'd read it until his eyes blurred and his throat ached from holding back emotion. That he'd underlined one sentence. "I never stopped choosing you. I just didn't know how to show." Many times the paper had started to tear. That he had almost opened the door that night, almost taken the smallest step towards something like forgiveness. Almost. It had become their theme, hadn't it? Almost saying what mattered, almost reaching out, almost fixing it before it shattered, almost wasn't enough anymore. He still remembered the last time they had truly spoken, not texted, not waved across a room, not exchanged forced words in front of others. It had been in the practice studio, the one with the mirrors that never seemed to reflect what they felt. Taehyung had been sitting on the floor, exhausted and quiet, lacing his shoes in silence. Jungkook had walked in late, hoodie pulled over his head like armor. "Are we okay?" Taehyung had asked without looking up. Jungkook had hesitated. And that hesitation had been louder than a no. They hadn't been okay for a long time. Now, with the letter still vibrating in his bones, Taehyung felt the weight of every missed moment. Regret was a persistent companion. It whispered in his ears at night, sat beside him at breakfast, stood behind him in the mirror. But so was hope. That was the worst part. Because hope hurt too. Some nights he imagined opening the door, just like that. No warning, no preparation. Just flinging it wide and finding Jungkook on the other side, eyes wide and heart open. But those were dreams, and dreams had a way of collapsing under daylight. Elsewhere in the city, Jungkook was unraveling in his own way. He threw himself into rehearsals like a man possessed, pushing harder than necessary, faster than safe. His vocals cracked more than once. His ankle throbbed from a misstep. His manager raised concerns. Jimin stared at him during practice, brows furrowed in unspoken worry. "You're not sleeping," Jimin finally said one night when they were alone in the dressing room. "I am." "Not enough." Jungkook didn't argue. He didn't have the energy. Instead, he stared at his reflection, at the boy behind the tired eyes, and wondered when he had stopped recognizing himself. "I saw him," he said quietly. Jimin paused. "Taehyung." "I went to his place, left him a letter." Jimin didn't ask for details. He just nodded, slow and heavy. "Did he say anything?" "No," Jungkook swallowed, "but the letter disappeared, so I guess he read it." A silence stretched between them. "Do you want him back?" Jimin finally asked. Jungkook looked up sharply, like the question had caught him off guard. "It's not about want," he murmured. "It's about needing him. I don't feel whole without him." Jimin didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. In his apartment, Taehyung had begun painting again. Not for commissions, not for fans, just for himself. It had started as a way to distract his mind, colors on canvas to silence the noise in his head. But slowly the brushstrokes turned familiar. Faces, shapes, memories. One night he painted Jungkook's hands without meaning to. The way they used to hold a mic. The way they used to tremble when nervous. The way they had once held his own. He stared at the finished painting for hours. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even good, but it was honest. And maybe that was the point. He didn't send a picture. Didn't call. Didn't text. But the next day, he found himself walking without thinking. Past the coffee shop they loved. Past the park bench where Jungkook had once made him laugh so hard he cried. Past the bookstore where they had both hidden during a thunderstorm and read poetry aloud like kids playing grown-up. His feet stopped in front of the building. Not his own. Jungkook. He stood outside the door, heart pounding, the echo of every word of pounding through his chest. He raised his hand to knock. And stopped. He couldn't do it. Not yet. He turned, heart in pieces, and walked away. Jungkook never knew. Until days later when his doorman casually mentioned, "Your friend with the blonde hair came by. Looked like he was going to knock, but changed his mind." Jungkook froze. He didn't ask anything else. He didn't want to seem desperate. But his chest burned with new ache. Taehyung had been there, so close, so damn close. The next week passed in unbearable tension. They didn't reach out. Neither did, but everything between them was louder now. Their silence felt like a conversation full of pain. It all came to a head at the charity event. They hadn't expected to see each other there. It was industry-wide, big names, big stages. Jungkook showed up out of duty. Taehyung arrived late, unannounced. Their eyes met across the room like magnets colliding. Jimin noticed first. He turned toward Yoongi and whispered, "Don't let them implode." But it was too late. Taehyung walked toward the open bar. Jungkook followed without meaning to. They ended up inches apart, both pretending they hadn't noticed. "Did you like the wine?" Jungkook asked softly, voice strained. Taehyung's eyes didn't move from the glass in his hand. "I didn't drink it. I meant the letter." Taehyung stiffened. He didn't speak for a long time. Then finally, without looking up, "I read it every night." Jungkook's breath hitched. Taehyung turned toward him slowly. "Why now?" "Because I was scared before," Jungkook said. "Of losing you, of being honest, of not being enough. And then I realized I lost you anyway." Taehyung's expression didn't shift, but his fingers gripped the glass tighter. "I'm not asking you to forget everything," Jungkook continued. "I'm just asking if there's still a part of you, any part, that wants to try again." Taehyung closed his eyes. And when he opened them, something had changed. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked past Jungkook. Not away, but toward the balcony. Jungkook followed. The air outside was crisp, sharp with winter. The stars were buried behind clouds, but the city lights made up for them. Taehyung leaned against the railing, eyes forward. "When you stood at my door," he said, "I almost opened it." Jungkook stood beside him, barely breathing. "I was scared too," Taehyung admitted, "because I didn't know if you came to say goodbye or to ask me to stay." "I came to ask you to come home," Jungkook whispered. Taehyung looked at him, and this time he didn't look away. Jungkook's heart pounded in his throat. "Are you still asking?" Taehyung asked. Jungkook nodded. "I'm still asking." Taehyung exhaled. Then finally he stepped closer. And the space between them disappeared. Taehyung didn't move when the space between them disappeared. He didn't step back. He didn't lean in. He just stood still, letting the moment stretch. Letting silence breathe between their bodies like a fragile bridge. His eyes were unreadable, their usual warmth dimmed by something older, something heavier than just pain. And Jungkook stood there, chest rising and falling with every breath he was too scared to trust. He didn't know if Taehyung was going to say something, walk away again, or break in front of him. But then Taehyung exhaled. It was so soft, so quiet. But it wasn't just air, it was surrender. Not to Jungkook, not to forgiveness, but to feeling, raw and unchecked. It was the breath of someone who had been holding everything in for far too long. "I didn't think you'd actually come," Taehyung murmured finally. Jungkook's voice cracked without warning. "I didn't think you'd read it." "I didn't want to," Taehyung replied, looking out into the city again, avoiding his eyes. "But I couldn't throw it away either. That letter, it was the first time I heard your voice honestly in months." Jungkook nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I didn't know how to say it before, not without messing it up, not without sounding selfish." "You were selfish," Taehyung whispered, and there was no venom in it, no accusation, just truth. "And I was angry for a long time, not because you left, but because I waited. I waited for you every day, even after you stopped calling." Jungkook closed his eyes. "I know." "No, you don't." Taehyung's voice grew louder, more pained. "You don't know what it's like to be in a room full of people and still feel like you're screaming into a void. You were there and still so far away. You made me question myself, Jungkook, over and over again." "I hated myself for that," Jungkook said softly. "I hate myself for a lot of things. I just didn't know how to fix it then. I kept thinking if I gave you space, you'd come back. But space turned into silence, and silence turned into losing you." "And now," Taehyung asked, finally turning toward him, eyes glassy, "now you're here, saying the words I waited so long to hear. But what changed?" Jungkook looked at him, really looked at him, like memorizing someone he had seen 1,000 times but never truly seen until now. "I realized that being without you didn't make anything better. I thought I could numb it, ignore it, bury it in work or music or late-night distractions. But nothing worked. Nothing filled the space you left. I kept thinking maybe it would fade, that if I gave it enough time, the ache would stop." He took a step closer, voice breaking. "It never did." Taehyung's lips trembled, but he said nothing. Jungkook continued, "You were always the one who saw through me. You knew when I was lying, even when I convinced myself it was truth. You knew how to read my silences. You knew when I needed someone before I even asked. And I took that for granted. I thought you'd always be there. That no matter how far I pulled, you'd pull me back." His hands shook slightly at his sides. "But you stopped pulling, and I deserved that." Taehyung blinked, tears welling but refusing to fall. Jungkook's voice turned gentler. "I'm not asking for you to forget or to pretend none of it happened. I just want a chance, not to erase the past, but to write a different future." A long pause. Then quietly Taehyung asked, "Do you really think we can just go back?" Jungkook shook his head. "No, and I don't want to. I want to move forward, with everything we've learned, with everything we've survived." Taehyung closed his eyes. The wind brushed against them, lifting strands of hair off his forehead. When he opened them again, there was something gentler there. something wounded but open. "I still don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. Jungkook nodded, stepping back just slightly. "Then I'll wait, however long it takes." That night they didn't hug. They didn't touch. They didn't make promises or exchange grand declarations. But for the first time in a long while, they stood side by side again, on the same page, even if not yet in the same sentence. The days that followed weren't cinematic. There were no fireworks, no dramatic reunions, just quiet texts, one-word replies, occasional voice notes. It wasn't easy. They relapsed into silence more than once. But now the silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like space being rebuilt, carefully, respectfully. Jungkook would walk by the art studio, where Taehyung sometimes worked, and leave a coffee by the door. Taehyung would respond with a small heart emoji hours later. Jungkook started writing lyrics again, lyrics that sounded like hope. Taehyung painted more portraits. Many were faceless, but the hands always looked like Jungkook. There was a night weeks later when Jungkook received a text that simply read, "Come upstairs." No context, no warning, just the invitation he had once longed for. He arrived breathless. When Taehyung opened the door, he didn't speak. He just stepped aside to let him in. The apartment looked the same, but it felt different, warmer, lived in. The smell of paint and soft music lingering in the background. They sat on the couch, close but not touching. "I kept the letter," Taehyung said. "I know," Jungkook replied, voice barely above a whisper. "I want to try," Taehyung murmured, "but I need you to promise me something." "Anything. If you're ever scared again or confused or unsure, just say it. Don't disappear. Don't let the silence grow between us again." Jungkook reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed his pinky against Taehyung's. "I promise." For the first time in months, Taehyung smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It didn't fix everything, but it was real, and it was his. Later that night, when Jungkook finally fell asleep on Taehyung's couch, curled beneath the blanket Taehyung had once folded away in grief, Taehyung sat beside him and just watched. He traced the lines of Jungkook's face in his mind, the boy he had once loved so loudly, now learning to love more carefully, slowly, with intention. Not everything broken needed to be thrown away. Some things were worth mending. Some things were worth the wait. And for the first time in a long time, Taehyung didn't feel like he was waiting alone. Jungkook didn't stir when the first golden threads of sunlight crept across the hardwood floor, slowly painting his face in warmth. He lay still on the couch, limbs tangled in the blanket, chest rising in a steady rhythm that Taehyung hadn't seen in months. There was something innocent about the way he slept, a vulnerability that made time slow around him. His face was softened by sleep, lips slightly parted, one hand curled near his cheek like a child who had finally stopped running. Taehyung sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, watching. It had been hours. He hadn't been able to sleep. Not because of anxiety or dread, but because he hadn't wanted to miss this moment, this stillness, this fragile evidence that things were shifting, that maybe the world hadn't ended after all. The apartment was quiet. No notifications pinged. No schedules loomed. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, and the slow, steady sound of Jungkook breathing. Taehyung let his eyes wander over the room. So much had changed, and yet so much hadn't. The wall beside the record player still had the faded poster they'd put up one night during a thunderstorm, half drunk on cheap wine and memories. The bookshelf still bore the spine-cracked poetry collections they used to read from, trading verses like confessions. But the air felt different now, like something old had finally exhaled. When Jungkook finally stirred, his lashes fluttered slowly, and his eyes opened in that dazed, heavy-lidded way that made him look younger than he was. He blinked at the ceiling for a moment, confusion flickering, before he turned his head and found Taehyung sitting nearby. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Jungkook whispered, "You didn't sleep." Taehyung smiled faintly, didn't want to. Jungkook sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You watched me all night." "Not all night," Taehyung said. "Just long enough to remember why I missed you." Jungkook's breath caught. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, suddenly feeling more exposed than naked. "I was scared to fall asleep. I thought I'd wake up and you'd be gone." "I almost was," Taehyung admitted, his voice low. "Twice." Jungkook nodded. "I don't blame you." There was another pause, one filled with shared understanding. Jungkook stood, stretching slowly. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city, its morning energy starting to buzz into life. He turned back around, leaning against the windowsill. "Everything looks the same," he said. Taehyung raised a brow. "Outside or in here?" Jungkook shook his head. "Both." "You were expecting something else." "I don't know." Jungkook replied honestly. "Maybe I was hopping time would write "V done more, fixed more." Taehyung took a sip of his coffee. "Time doesn't fix things, people do." Jungkook looked at him for a long moment. "Then let's fix it." It wasn't a question, it wasn't a plea. It was a vow. Taehyung stood slowly, walking over to the sink to rinse his cup. Jungkook followed him with his eyes, watching the casual familiarity of the movement. It stirred something deep in his chest, an ache, a longing, and a gratitude all braided into one. "What does fixing it look like to you?" Taehyung asked, not turning around. Jungkook answered without hesitation. "Waking up next to you again, hearing your voice when I come home, not having to wonder if you're okay, not having to guess if we're still us." Taehyung set the mug down and finally faced him. "And what if we break again?" "Then we try again," Jungkook said. "And again, if we have to. I'd rather break 100 times with you than pretend I'm whole without you." Taehyung's eyes shone with unspoken emotion. "You're good with words these days." Jungkook walked toward him slowly. "Only because I'm saying what I should "V said all along." He stopped just a breath away, their proximity electric but tender. "I love you," Jungkook said. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, soft, like truth should be. Taehyung's lips parted, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't hesitate. "I never stopped." He reached forward and slipped his hand into Jungkook's. Their fingers threaded together like muscle memory. The kiss that followed was not desperate. It wasn't rushed. It was slow, careful, familiar, like finding a favorite song you thought you'd lost and realizing you still remember every note. It didn't erase the pain, it didn't rewrite the past, but it planted something new in the ashes. The weeks that followed were not easy. They had to learn each other again. Learn how to speak without fear, how to argue without wounding, how to forgive without forgetting. Jungkook had to learn patience. Taehyung had to learn to trust again. They made mistakes. They misread silences. They sometimes walked on old cracks in the floor of their relationship and reopened old wounds. But they also laughed again. Really laughed. The kind of laughter that shook their bodies and left them breathless, tangled in bedsheets or on park benches or in crowded waiting rooms, where nothing else mattered except that the other was still there. They didn't post photos, didn't make announcements. It wasn't about performance anymore. It wasn't about convincing the world they were okay. It was about building something quiet, something real. There was a night, long after everything had begun to feel steady again, when they sat on the rooftop of Taehyung's apartment, wrapped in jackets, sipping warm tea as the city lights blinked below them. "Do you remember that night?" Taehyung asked, staring out at the skyline. Jungkook looked at him. "Which one?" "The one when you stood at my door and I didn't open it." Jungkook smiled sadly. "I'll never forget it." "I was on the other side," Taehyung said. Hand on the knob, heart racing, but I was paralyzed. I wanted so badly to let you in, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was pride. I'm glad you didn't open it, Jungkook said. Taehyung turned to him surprised. Why? Because if you had, maybe we would V rushed back into something broken. Maybe we would V pretended things were fine when they were. That silence, it forced us to listen. Taehyung leaned his head on Jungkook's shoulder. You always see the good in everything. I only ever saw the good in you. They sat in silence, the wind tousling their hair, the stars faint above the glow of the city. And then Jungkook whispered, "Promise me something." "Anything. If we ever reach that door again, on either side open it, even if it's just a crack, even if you can't say anything yet, just don't leave it closed." Taehyung nodded slowly, gripping his hand tighter. "I promise." And this time, they both knew it would be kept. The promise lingered between them like a silent vow etched into the air. And in the days that followed, it wasn't words that held them together. It was consistency. The kind that came from shared routines, subtle glances, and the quiet way they began to exist again, not just with each other, but for each other. Morning sunlight became softer when, filtered through the curtain, Taehyung pulled back just enough so Jungkook wouldn't oversleep. The scent of brewed coffee became more than caffeine. It became memory. Jungkook's toothbrush appeared next to Taehyung's without ceremony. Their lives were folding back into each other slowly, like pages finally aligning after being bent by too many chapters of miscommunication. They didn't rush, they didn't dare. Each step forward was earned in late-night talks with no script, in the way Jungkook would pause mid-sentence just to ask, "Am I saying too much?" Or how Taehyung would reach across the table during lunch just to brush his thumb over Jungkook's hand, as if to say, "You're still here, and I still see you." It wasn't perfect. Some days Taehyung would retreat, eyes dim, shoulders tense, swallowed in thoughts that even he couldn't name. And Jungkook, he still battled the impulse to fix everything too fast, to give too much too soon, as if love could be measured in overcompensation. But they were learning. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals and press interviews, they found themselves back in Taehyung's apartment, the living room dimly lit, music low. Jungkook had changed into sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, hair still damp from the shower. Taehyung was curled up on the couch, sketching absently in a notebook he didn't plan to show anyone. Jungkook watched him from the kitchen for a while, the soft crease between Taehyung's brows, the way his lips moved ever so slightly when concentrating, the scratch of pencil against paper. "You never stopped drawing," Jungkook said finally, approaching with 2 mugs of hot tea. Taehyung glanced up, lips quirking into a faint smile. "It was the only way I could talk to myself without lying." Jungkook handed him the mug, settling beside him, thigh brushing thigh. "Did you draw me?" he asked quietly. Taehyung didn't answer right away. He closed the sketchbook instead, sipping his tea with a slow breath. "Every version of you." Jungkook blinked. "What does that mean?" Taehyung looked at him, eyes honest. "The version that laughed without fear, the one that walked away, the one I hated, the one I missed, and the one I prayed would come back." Jungkook set his mug down on the coffee table carefully. His chest ached with all the things he still hadn't said. "You can tear those pages out if you want," Taehyung added. But Jungkook shook his head. "No, don't erase any of it, even if it hurts. That's part of me too." Taehyung studied him for a long time, and then nodded. That night, they didn't sleep in separate spaces. Jungkook's arm found its way around Taehyung's waist beneath the sheets. Their bodies curled instinctively into that familiar fit. No kisses, no urgency, just presence, breath to breath. At 3:14 a.m., Jungkook whispered into Taehyung's neck, "What if I mess up again?" And Taehyung, without opening his eyes, whispered back, "Then we start over again, as many times as it takes." The weeks unfolded with new light. Jungkook began to hum more, in the mornings while brushing his teeth, in the shower, on the rooftop with his back to the wind. Taehyung started wearing color again, rust orange, olive green, even soft pink, the kind of tones that once lit up his face and made him look like art come alive. They started reclaiming their places together. The bookstore they'd avoided since the day everything began to fall apart. The old ramen shop with the crooked table where they'd once had a fight so loud the owner had turned up the radio just to cover it. The studio space where their hands had once brushed over piano keys, too nervous to admit it meant something. This time when they returned, there was no shame, no pretending the past hadn't happened. There was only acknowledgement and the decision to step through it. One night, they were invited to a private event for an artist friend. A quiet rooftop gathering under string lights, where musicians and creatives passed around guitars and shared stories like sacred rituals. Taehyung had hesitated when the invitation came. "Too public," Jungkook asked gently. "Too vulnerable," Taehyung admitted. But they went. Hand in hand, under the quiet stars, surrounded by faces that once knew them as a pair and had seen the quiet unraveling of them. And no one said a word. Because they didn't have to. They watched as Taehyung stood beside Jungkook while he sang a stripped-down version of an unreleased melody, his voice cracking slightly at the bridge, and Taehyung's hand pressed gently to his back like an anchor. It wasn't a performance. It was a beginning. After the final note faded, there was silence. And then applause, not the loud, hollow kind, the soft kind, the real kind, the kind people gave when they witnessed something honest. Later that night, Taehyung asked, "Was it too much?" "No," Jungkook replied, "it was just enough." Back at home, they shared a quiet dinner. Not everything had to be profound. Sometimes healing tasted like leftover dumplings and steamed rice with soy sauce. They sat cross-legged on the floor, legs touching, as they watched an old animated film they had seen a dozen times. But even that felt different now, like building new memories on top of old ruins. That night, Taehyung reached across the blanket between them and took Jungkook's hand. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked, not looking up from the screen. Jungkook didn't answer right away. He let the question breathe, turning it over in his mind. "I think people don't change," he said finally. "They reveal. The person I am now was always inside me. I just didn't know how to let him exist before." Taehyung turned to him then. "And who is that person?" Jungkook met his gaze. "The one who knows he's not whole without you, but also the one who's learning not to need you to feel enough. I want to be better, not just for us, but for me." Taehyung leaned in, resting his forehead against Jungkook. And in the hush of that moment, the world melted away. There would still be hard days ahead, they both knew it. There would be questions they didn't have answers to, moments of doubt, days when the past would creep in uninvited, whispering old fears into new beginnings. But for now, they had this. Breath to breath, hand in hand, not perfect, not unscarred, but present. The door had been closed once, and now it stood wide open. Not just physically, but in the way Jungkook looked at Taehyung without fear. In the way Taehyung didn't flinch when he leaned into love again. They were no longer trying to return to who they had been. They were becoming who they were meant to be together. The world didn't pause for them, even when their hearts moved at a slower, more careful rhythm. There were still schedules to follow, cameras to face, deadlines to meet. The spotlight was always hungry, always watching, and neither of them had the luxury of retreating for too long. But within that chaos, they had carved out something sacred, a quiet shelter. It showed in the smallest things, how Jungkook would instinctively place his hand at the small of Taehyung's back when they entered a room full of people, How Taehyung would glance across the table during meetings just to check that Jungkook had eaten. It was in how they didn't speak over each other anymore, how they didn't avoid difficult conversations, how they didn't let days pass in silence pretending nothing was wrong. They learned painfully and beautifully that love was not just the spark of a kiss or the weight of longing. It was the work, the showing up, again and again. It was Taehyung making space for Jungkook's late-night songwriting binges, even when he wanted to sleep. It was Jungkook learning to sit in silence with Taehyung when he was spiraling and not trying to fix him, just hold his hand and breathe beside him. Some days were light, filled with spontaneous laughter, shared playlists, silly photos taken with greasy fingers after fast food runs. On those days, it felt like the world was singing just for them. Other days were heavy. Like the afternoon Taehyung came home from a family visit, unusually quiet. He dropped his bag at the door and walked straight to the piano, not saying a word. He played a few soft chords before stopping abruptly, his fingers hovering in the air like he didn't know what came next. Jungkook, sensing the shift in energy, didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. He walked over slowly and sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, and placed his hand over Taehyung on the keys. Not to guide, but to stay. Taehyung let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding and leaned into him. "My dad asked if I was still seeing you," he said softly. Jungkook didn't move. "What did you say?" "I told him the truth, that we never stopped, not really." "And?" He nodded, Taehyung murmured. Didn't say much, but his eyes softened, like he understood something even I didn't know how to explain. Jungkook didn't answer. He just pressed his lips gently to Taehyung's temple, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. It was like that, living in moments that didn't ask to be dramatic or poetic, just real. They began working together more deliberately again, too. Collaborations that once felt complicated became fluid. Jungkook's lyrics, raw and vulnerable, met Taehyung's melodies with harmony instead of friction. In the studio, their synergy returned, not as a firestorm but as a steady heartbeat. One track they co-created late one night in March was unlike anything they'd done before. It wasn't for release. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was honest. The verses were filled with half-spoken regrets, and the chorus pulsed with promises, not dramatic ones, but the kind you whispered into someone's skin in the dark, when the world was quiet enough to hear the truth. Taehyung played it on loop the next morning, eyes closed, fingers tapping against his coffee mug. Jungkook watched him from across the kitchen, heart full. "We should release it," Jungkook said. "Not yet," Taehyung replied. "Let's keep this one for us just a little longer." They both understood. Not everything had to be shared. Some things were meant to be held close, nurtured in private until they were strong enough to face the world. Spring came slowly, touching everything in soft greens and early blossoms. One Saturday morning, Jungkook woke up to find Taehyung standing barefoot on the balcony, shirtless, cup of tea in one hand and phone in the other. The light touched him gently, outlining his frame like a painting. Jungkook stepped up behind him, wrapping his arms around his waist and resting his chin on his shoulder. "What are you looking at?" he asked, voice still gravelly from sleep. Taehyung tilted his phone so Jungkook could see. It was an old photo, a candid someone had taken years ago of them laughing at a festival, cheeks flushed, eyes crinkled, fingers just barely brushing. "I saved it," Taehyung said. "Even when we weren't speaking, I couldn't delete it." Jungkook pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "I remember that day. You made me dance in the middle of the crowd." "You hated it." "I loved it," Jungkook admitted. "I was just pretending not to, so I wouldn't fall harder for you than I already had." Taehyung turned in his arms slowly, their faces inches apart. "Too late for that now," he said. Jungkook smiled, way too late. They kissed, slow and familiar, like a song they knew by heart. Time passed, but differently now, not rushed, not wasted, just lived. They traveled again, though this time not for work. They took a quiet trip to the coast, just the two of them, no entourage, no plans. They walked barefoot on the sand, shared headphones while watching the tide, fell asleep to the sound of waves and woke to sun filtering through linen curtains. Taehyung sketched the horizon one afternoon, and Jungkook sat beside him humming, crafting lyrics that would never leave the pages of his notebook. It didn't have to lead to anything. It just had to be. Later that evening, over grilled fish and cold beer, Taehyung raised his glass. "To second chances," he said. Jungkook tapped his glass to his, to not wasting them. And when they returned to the city, things weren't louder, they were clearer. Their love wasn't a secret, but it wasn't a spectacle either. It existed quietly in the way Jungkook's hand always found Taehyung. In the car, in the way Taehyung rested his head on Jungkook's shoulder during long flights, in the way they made eye contact across chaotic rooms and knew exactly what the other needed. They didn't have to prove anything anymore. Not to the world. Not to each other. The night of Jungkook's birthday, Taehyung surprised him with a video, a compilation of clips he'd been quietly collecting over the years. Footage of Jungkook laughing in the kitchen, asleep with a pen in hand, dancing when he thought no one was watching, whispering lyrics to himself under his breath. "You made this," Jungkook whispered, eyes glassy. "I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you," Taehyung replied. Jungkook turned to him, jaw clenched as emotion welled up inside him. "I wasted so much time," he said. Taehyung reached out and cupped his cheek. "You didn't waste it, you were just finding your way back." And as Jungkook leaned into his touch, a tear slipping down his cheek, Taehyung smiled. "We both were." Love, in the end, wasn't the fireworks. It wasn't the perfect photograph or the grand reunion. It was the door that opened again. The hand that stayed. The silence that no longer scared them. They had been broken, but they were no longer afraid of their cracks. Because light, they had learned, still found a way through. That summer bloomed around them like a second chance. The days stretched longer and so did the silences, no longer filled with the weight of things unsaid, but with comfort. Safe silences. The kind that didn't need to be broken. The kind that spoke louder than apologies ever could. Jungkook found himself singing more in the mornings, sometimes nonsense melodies with sleepy syllables, sometimes fragments of real songs that would eventually grow into full tracks. Taehyung would sit nearby, sketchbook open on his lap, pretending to draw but often just watching him. He said it was for reference. Jungkook never argued. The way Taehyung looked at him now, openly, without shields or shadows, felt like a gift every time. Their apartment had grown into a home again. The framed photo of the two of them, once stored in a drawer during the silence between them, now sat on the windowsill. Taehyung's favorite hoodie made its way back to Jungkook's closet without comment. Jungkook's cologne lingered on Taehyung's pillow more often than not. But home wasn't the apartment. It was the feeling that followed them, even when they were apart. When Jungkook traveled for promotions, Taehyung would send him small voice notes at night, fragments of poems, the sound of rain against glass, his voice humming old songs. Jungkook would listen with his eyes closed in dark hotel rooms, heart aching with a gentle kind of longing. Not the kind that broke him, but the kind that reminded him of what waited for him. And when Taehyung had to fly overseas for a photo shoot, Jungkook slipped a letter into his carry-on. No address, no signature, just a note folded into quarters tucked between his sketchbook pages. "Whatever city you're in, I hope it remembers your laughter. I hope it knows how lucky it is to carry your footsteps." Taehyung read it on the plane and didn't stop smiling for the next 3 hours. They still argued. Love didn't erase that. There was the night Jungkook came home later than promised, phone battery dead, exhaustion hanging off him like a second skin. Taehyung had waited, packing the apartment, worry bubbling into frustration. When the door finally opened, the tension snapped. You couldn't borrow someone's phone. Taehyung's voice was sharp, too sharp. Jungkook tossed his bag down. I said I was sorry. You always say that, Taehyung cut in, and then you do it again. They stood there, words heavy between them. Jungkook looked away. I didn't do it to hurt you. I know, Taehyung said, softer now, but you did, you still did. That night, they went to bed without touching. But the next morning, Jungkook reached for him before the sun rose, pulled him close, whispered, I'll do better. And Taehyung, eyes still closed, whispered back, that's all I needed to hear. It was never about being perfect. It was about showing up. Again and again. The industry noticed, too. Not in dramatic headlines or tabloid whispers, but in the way they stood beside each other during interviews, how their eyes met mid-stage, how their energies, once disjointed, now flowed in sync again. Fans began to speculate, but most didn't ask. Most of them just felt it, that whatever had once broken had healed. One afternoon, while walking through a small park tucked behind a music venue they used to frequent, Jungkook paused beneath a tree blooming with soft pink petals. Taehyung stopped beside him. This was the spot, Jungkook murmured. Taehyung turned. What spot? Where I almost told you, Jungkook said. Years ago, right after our first late-night session. You were humming something under your breath and the light hit your face just right. I almost said it. Said what? That I was falling in love with you. Taehyung smiled, slow and knowing. I knew. Jungkook looked at him, surprised. I knew, Taehyung repeated. But I needed you to say it when you were ready. Not because the moment was beautiful or cinematic, but because you couldn't hold it in anymore. I'm still falling, Jungkook said. Then fall, Taehyung whispered, stepping closer. I'll catch you. They kissed under that tree. No cameras, no flashes, just wind and petals and years worth of memory turning into something present and alive. Later that evening, they sat on the floor of their living room, surrounded by old photos they'd finally decided to go through. Some were blurry, some were candid, some were so full of joy it almost hurt to look at. This one, Taehyung said, holding up a Polaroid of them at the airport, sleepy and smiling. This was the first time I knew you were it for me. Jungkook took it, stared. You were holding my wrist, Taehyung said. Not my hand, but it felt like you were holding me. You looked back just once to check if I was still there. That was the moment. Jungkook set the photo down and kissed him, slow and grateful. The night melted around them. Music played low, candles flickered. The world outside moved on, indifferent. But in that room, time folded inward. I don't want to miss another minute, Jungkook whispered against Taehyung's skin. Then don't, Taehyung breathed, stay. I'm not going anywhere. They moved together like water, familiar, patient, reverent. They traced old scars with new touches, marked each other not with urgency, but with intention. And when they fell asleep tangled in the sheets, it wasn't out of exhaustion, it was surrender, to peace, to healing, to the slow, beautiful truth that they had found their way home. Again. And this time they weren't leaving. The days that followed moved like pages in a well-worn novel, familiar yet new, each one building on the last with a quiet elegance. They lived slowly now, even when the world spun too fast around them. It was in the morning routines that steadied them, in the scent of coffee before the sun rose, in the soft brushing of shoulders in doorways, in music that no one else would ever hear because it wasn't meant to be released. It was meant to be shared, between hearts that had been through war and learned how to rest. Jungkook had begun keeping a journal again, not a rigid diary but a messy, scattered collection of fragments, lines of lyrics, quotes from conversations, random dreams he woke up remembering, moments he never wanted to lose again. Sometimes Taehyung would find the small leather-bound notebook left open on the kitchen counter or beside the bed, filled with Jungkook's handwriting, slanted, emotional, unfiltered. One entry read, He said stay, and I didn't even realize how long I'd been waiting to be told I could. Taehyung never asked about the pages. He didn't need to. They were living the unwritten lines together, one breath at a time. There was a morning when Taehyung stood at the bathroom mirror, toothbrush in hand, eyes fixed on his own reflection as if searching for something. Jungkook passed behind him, kissed his bare shoulder and said, "You're the most beautiful when you're not trying to be." And Taehyung, who had spent so many years sculpting himself into what others expected, let out a laugh that sounded like release. They began talking about the future more deliberately now, not in hypotheticals, not in abstract hopes, but in tangible pieces. A dog, maybe, a home outside the city, somewhere with space to grow vegetables and hang laundry in the sun, somewhere with enough quiet for late-night painting and afternoon songwriting, somewhere their friends could visit but they could also disappear in. Jungkook said, "I want a studio with windows." Taehyung replied, "And I want a porch where we can sit in the rain." Neither of them smiled at those wishes like they were too big. Because nothing felt too far anymore. There were public moments, too. Moments where their closeness couldn't hide behind anonymity. A camera capturing the way Taehyung looked at Jungkook when he wasn't speaking. A press photo where their fingers nearly touched. Interviews where their answers mirrored each other's, unscripted, natural. They never confirmed anything. But the truth didn't need confirmation. It was visible in the way they existed, parallel, entwined, undeniable. One night they were invited to a small award ceremony, nothing flashy, intimate, a celebration of artistry rather than fame. Taehyung wore all black with a simple silver chain. Jungkook wore navy, his hair pushed back, eyes steady. As they stood backstage waiting for the curtain to rise, Jungkook leaned into Taehyung's ear and whispered, "I still get nervous." Taehyung reached for his hand, gently squeezing. "Then be nervous, I'll be right here." They stood side by side when their names were called, accepting an award for a collaborative piece that had broken records months earlier. They didn't prepare a speech. They didn't need to. They thanked their team, their fans, the people who had held them up. And then, before the mic was passed, Jungkook glanced at Taehyung and added, "And thank you to the person who reminded me that coming home isn't about place. It's about who waits for you." The crowd applauded, not knowing the full weight of those words. But Taehyung did. Later that night, barefoot on the hotel balcony, city lights flickering below them, Taehyung wrapped a blanket around Jungkook's shoulders and murmured, "You're not allowed to say things like that without warning me first." Jungkook smiled into the fabric. Was it too much? "It was perfect," Taehyung said, "and I almost cried." "You can cry," Jungkook said. "You're safe here." Taehyung nodded, pulling him close. "I know." The following weekend, they drove without a destination. Just open roads, a playlist of old songs, and the wind teasing Jungkook's hair out the window. Taehyung's hand rested casually on Jungkook's knee, fingers drawing invisible patterns. They stopped at a lake just before sunset. The water mirrored the sky like glass and the world felt suspended. They took off their shoes, rolled up their pants and walked into the shallows, the water cool against their skin. Taehyung skipped a stone, watching the ripples. "I used to think love was supposed to be dramatic," he said, "like fireworks and declarations and running through airports." Jungkook chuckled, "Too many movies." "Maybe," Taehyung smiled, "but now I think it's this." He looked at Jungkook. "It's being here with you and not needing to say anything." They didn't talk for a while after that. They just stood there, ankle-deep in water, surrounded by silence, letting the moment hold them. That night, lying on a blanket under the stars, Jungkook traced constellations on Taehyung's forearm with his fingertip. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked. Taehyung looked up. "We already are." "No, I mean long-term, through everything." Taehyung turned toward him, eyes soft. "I think we will, not because we're perfect, but because we try, every day." Jungkook pressed a kiss to his shoulder. That's enough for me. They watched the stars until they fell asleep, tangled together beneath the wide open sky. Seasons turned. Leaves fell. Time passed. But some things remained. Like the way Taehyung always waited for Jungkook at the door when he came home late. Like how Jungkook always brought back Taehyung's favorite pastry, even when he claimed he wasn't hungry. Like how they still danced in the kitchen when no one was watching. Like how every night before they turned off the lights, Jungkook would whisper, "You're my safe place," and Taehyung would answer, "And you're mine." Their love no longer needed fixing.